Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, here with my co-host Alan Reinach, who is president of the Church State Council. And together we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. And today we really are doing a deep dive into political extremes, Alan. It's a big topic. It's one that I think will surprise a lot of people. So why don't we get straight into our interview with scholar Matthew D. Taylor. We are delighted to have with us today Dr. Matthew Taylor, who is a nationally known author and academic. He's senior scholar, the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, which is located in Baltimore, Maryland. And he is also creator of the audio documentary series Charismatic Revival Fury, the New Apostolic Reformation. And to top that off, he has a new book coming out this fall, which I have already pre-ordered, Matt, and it is called The Violent Take It by Force, a Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we're delighted that you're here because the NAR has been in the news recently with a number of events, and it's related to a certain flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag, which I have to admit I was only vaguely aware of before it was revealed that Justice Samuel Alito had flown this at his beach home. Can you give us some background, first of all, on what this flag is?
Yeah, so maybe we could start with what the NAR is, because I think that
Sure.
might help us understand the flag. So
an acronym for the New Apostolic Reformation.
Yes, so the NAR stands for New Apostolic Reformation. It's a movement. It's really a set of leadership networks that were established in the late 1990s and early 2000s, mostly instigated and led by a Fuller Theological Seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner, who he was a church growth expert, and he became fascinated with the sector of evangelicalism that we would call the independent charismatic or non-denominational charismatic sector of evangelicalism. So these are non-denominational churches and ministries that are also trying to, when we talk about charismatic, trying to recapture the supernatural ethos of the early Christian church. These are folks who are interested in speaking in tongues, in modern prophecy, in beliefs about healing and the miraculous. And they're also very focused on revival and bringing about revival. And Wagner came to believe in the 1990s that that there would be a great revival that would renew the life of the Christian church at the end of time, that would be led by modern day apostles and prophets, that God would renew these offices of apostles and prophets that we see in the pages of the New Testament, that we see represented in the life of the early church. But those forms of leadership have more or less died out in most Christian traditions. But the NAR is an effort to invigorate and cultivate new apostles and prophets who will then lead the church into this, what they would call third great awakening. And so Wagner starts setting up these leadership networks. There's hundreds of leaders who join these networks who identify themselves as apostles and prophets. Wagner thought that he was an apostle with a special commission to do this. And they become very, very politically active in the mid to late 2000s, very radical in their approach to American politics. And they adopt something called dominion theology, which is a belief that Christians should dominate all sectors of society and that Christian influence should predominate throughout society. In the midst of the Obama administration, one of these NAR leaders, a disciple of Peter Wagner's, his name is Dutch Sheets, he was participating in a graduation ceremony at a Bible college, and one of his mentees who was speaking at the ceremony presented Dutch Sheets with a flag from the American Revolution. It's a white flag with a green pine tree at the center, and over the top of the flag it says, "An Appeal to Heaven." And this flag actually goes back to the Revolutionary War. It was originally commissioned by George Washington to fly over a small navy made up of cruisers that was centered in the colony of Massachusetts. And so this was a Revolutionary War flag. There were many flags in the Revolutionary War that were used, but this is one that has kind of been there throughout American history, has been a Revolutionary War reference. But Dutch Sheets in 2013 believed that he received a prophecy about this flag as he was presented with it, that this is the flag, the banner under which America was born. And he believed that this was a sign of a spiritual revolution that needs to take place through spiritual warfare. The NAR, as most charismatics, are very into spiritual warfare. That the redemption of America, the return of America to its original covenant status in Sheets' interpretation, would happen through rolling out and using this flag as a kind of symbolic banner, a coded symbol for this kind of revanchist vision of Christian nationalism.
Wow. See, I have some background. I've been studying up about the New Apostolic Reformation, and we can get into a lot more about that. I had no idea that the flag now became this symbol of basically a desire for a Christian takeover of our nation. And when I say that, Dominionism is not just about political dominance, it's cultural dominance, it's education, it's business, it's media, it's all encompassing, right? So this is a vision for a very exclusionary kind of Christian domination. But it's not just American, is it? It's global.
No, the NAR it's a form of Christian nationalism. We can talk about it using kind of the rubric of Christian nationalism, but I actually think it's more pertinent and accurate to describe the NAR as a form of Christian supremacy, a transnational form of Christian supremacy. Christian nationalism is a big phenomenon in the U.S. There's a lot of different visions and forms of Christian nationalism, some of them fairly passive and kind of nostalgic for a bygone era. And there's some forms of Christian nationalism that are very, very hardline and aggressive. And the NAR is one of these Christian supremacist, hardline Christian nationalist movements that has connections throughout the world. These are global networks. They call them apostolic networks. Some of them have tens of thousands of churches in them that span the different continents of the world. Some of these American apostles who are central to the NAR, including somebody like Dutch Sheets, are international celebrities in this non-denominational charismatic space. And there are tens of millions of people who've attached themselves to these visions of modern day apostles and prophets and to networks like the NAR in this vision of transforming the church through the leadership of apostles and prophets, but then transforming nations through the mobilization of Christians to take over positions of influence and then to have Christian power and dominance flow down into these societies. So maybe one way to think about it is I was raised as an evangelical in religious rights circles in the 1980s and 1990s. The model for societal transformation of the religious right in the late 20th century was voter mobilization, right? It was, we need to get more people involved in democracy, right? And even the terminology they use, we're the moral majority. And if we can just mobilize the moral majority, we can transform the nation. This is not that. This vision is about a top-down, a vanguard approach where you take over the positions of power and influence and then have that Christianity come to be have a coercive influence on the rest of society. So it's a very different model of how you change a society, and is a very, very aggressive Christian vision. And I'll just note that Dutch Sheets and many NAR leaders, and this is what my book and my podcasts are really about, were central to the organizing and mobilization of Christians for January 6th. And that is part of why, if you look at any of the footage from January 6th, you see these appeal to heaven flags really just peppered throughout the crowds. There are dozens, maybe even hundreds of these appeal to heaven flags there on January 6th, because the NAR used it as a kind of symbolic banner for this, both for Christian Trumpism, but then also for this effort to overturn the 2020 election.
So here is what fascinates me in what you have laid out so far, Matt, and that is that this sounds like a very well organized and pervasive organization. It's global. It's been in progress for a number of decades, and yet it is not that well known. But the ideas and the stance that it sort of promotes has become influential far beyond the borders of just its own organization, because I hear many of the things that you're talking about, I hear them reflected in many of the responses I get to the magazine that I edit. People are being influenced by this mindset, this worldview, and yet they're not aware of what NAR is. How do you explain that?
So the NAR has always had a bigger ideological footprint than the actual networks of the NAR. Part of this has to do with how media works in the charismatic world. So the way that ideas and even theology travels around this kind of independent charismatic world, which again, there aren't denominations, there aren't overarching statements of faith or institutions that bind these kind of networks and churches and ministries together. What holds them together is actually charismatic media, which there's dedicated charismatic media, things like Charisma News, Charisma Magazine. There are dedicated YouTube channels for modern prophecy. There's dedicated TV channels like God TV or CBN or TBN that cater specifically to charismatic Christians. And so ideas tend to move around there, not as doctrines, but what I call prophetic memes. These ideas, these kind of viral ideas that originally come from these charismatic prophets who claim that they are getting them directly from God. And then they travel around this kind of media sphere and get popularized and even spread beyond this charismatic media sphere. The Appeal to Heaven flag is a prophetic meme. And so Dutch Sheets takes this Revolutionary War flag and then reappropriates it as a symbol for Christian nationalism, and then uses these NAR networks, which really touch thousands of churches in the US, to spread this meme all over the place, all over social media. Many Christian lawmakers have attempted to fly the Appeal to Heaven flag over official government buildings, and it's even flown over a number of state capitals. Important Republican politicians will have the Appeal to Heaven flag in the backdrop as they are on Zoom calls or other video calls. So it's this kind of coded symbol, a shibboleth of Christian nationalism that has this other meaning, right? It has this historical meaning. And so when a major kind of politicians who've used the flag get called on it, they're like, oh, no, I just like the Revolutionary War, or I just like maritime history. So my colleague Bradley Onishi and I actually reported back in November that newly elevated House Speaker Mike Johnson actually flies an Appeal to Heaven flag outside of his congressional office. And when we reached out to his office to ask about the flag, he said, oh, I just appreciate the history. Of course, he also said, and I got it from such and such a pastor. And we looked up the pastor, and he's an NAR pastor, right? So it's and Mike Johnson is actually close to a disciple of Dutch Sheets, who is an apostle within his own, Mike Johnson's own district in Louisiana. So the NAR has spent decades both kind of developing these viral ideas that spread around throughout evangelical Christianity, but then also insinuating themselves into relational networks, into positions of power, and into connections with major government officials. And what we're seeing right now is the fruition of those efforts, particularly through their cultivation of Donald Trump, but it's also in other branches of our government.
So I think we want to maybe talk more about the flag, but I also want to put this movement in relationship with the rest of the Protestant and the Pentecostal community. Because my reading, I was interested to see, well, how is their view of apostles and prophets regarded, even within a Pentecostal movement that tends to be very receptive to these kinds of activities. And what, at least what I found, and you can tell us more, is that this is very extra biblical, and that there's a lot of rejection, on the doctrinal level, of the notion that God is raising up all these hundreds and hundreds of, self-proclaimed apostles, really, and literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of self-proclaimed apostles. That theologically, the movement is very much suspect.
Yeah, the NAR is quite controversial within broader American Christianity, even within American evangelicalism. So there's this paradox, right? That NAR, like the specific formulations of ideas, the specific biblical interpretations the NAR puts forward in terms of apostles and prophets have not been picked up in denominational Christianity, right? It's very popular
But even
within the
within
non-denominational
Pentecostal
space.
and more charismatic movements are still very suspicious.
Well, yeah, so Pentecostalism in the U.S. is by and large a denominational phenomenon, right? So the Pentecostal movement emerges in the early 20th century, especially centered around what is called the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles in 1906 and 1907. And from the start, there is conversation within Pentecostalism about apostles and prophets. In fact, many of the early Pentecostal sources will talk about it as an apostolic movement because they are trying, again, they're charismatic. They're trying to recapture that kind of the energy of the early church, this kind of miraculous expectation of the early church. But then when this idea of modern day apostles and prophets as functional offices in the life of the church starts to emerge in the 1940s and 1950s, most of the Pentecostal denominations reject that outright. And they say that is not our understanding of the biblical model of church governance. And so the part of why these ideas have flourished in that non-denominational space is that it was forced out of the Pentecostal denominations. It was forced out into these networks, these more amorphous networks of non-denominational charismatic churches, which is really an unregulated space within American Christianity. It's kind of the Wild West of American Christianity. We also, though, have to note that sector, this non-denominational charismatic sector, is growing rapidly in America. It's growing rapidly around the world. Just to give one statistic, experts estimate that in the year 1970, there were about 40 million non-denominational charismatics in the world. By 2020, 50 years later, it was around 320 million. Right? So this is a sector of global Christianity that has grown eightfold in 50 years. Right? That's one of the fastest growing movements in religious history. And so while these ideas you can kind of point to and say, okay, it's within this kind of narrow space, but the ideas have leaked out into broader American Christianity. A colleague of mine, Paul Jupe, who's a political scientist at Denison University, we put together a survey just earlier this year to see how far some of these NAR ideas had traveled. I knew that they'd traveled pretty far just anecdotally and observing how it would work, but we wanted to get some numbers to it. And so we did a survey of American Christians, and it was about half evangelical, half non-evangelical. And what we found was actually quite shocking. We narrowed it down to 7 kind of statements of ideas and doctrine that come out of the New Apostolic Reformation. Things like apostles and prophets exist today and should be integral to the leadership of the church. Of those 7, 6 out of the 7 had more than 50% of American evangelicals agreeing or strongly agreeing with those ideas. So you can say 15 years ago, these ideas were fringe. They were coming out of the fringes of American Christianity. Today, they're pretty mainstream in American evangelicalism. It doesn't mean they're not controversial. There's still many evangelicals who would push back on these ideas, but they have spread in their popularity along with Trump in these circles because these are the ideas that have been used to vindicate Trump theologically.
So I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, and that's related to the title of your book, The Violent Take It by Force. You know, the difference between using the democratic process to influence culture and being prepared to move outside or to override democracy to achieve your goals. Do you see that as sort of the defining, how does what you're talking about, what you're describing, how does that fall on the spectrum of other religious right movements that are also seeking to influence law and culture?
Well, the reality is, as I said, Christian nationalism, which again is a pretty broad spectrum of people who think that America is somehow intrinsically Christian or should be intrinsically Christian, and Christians or Christianity should be privileged in some way in American culture, right? There's a lot of different views and theologies that feed into Christian nationalism. But what we're seeing right now, and this has been catalyzed by January 6th, it was already on the rise before January 6th, really throughout the Trump administration since the 2016 campaign. More and more Christians embracing these ideas of Christian supremacy, of dominion theology, of Christianity becoming this coercive power within America. But what we've seen since January 6th is an accelerated radicalization. Many people are crossing that line from being kind of a hazy, sentimental Christian nationalist. Oh, I like God bless America. I want the flag in the sanctuary of my church kind of Christian nationalism, to this kind of more hardline Christian supremacy outlook that imagines America as being taken over by Christianity and turned into, and they would even sometimes use the term, a theocratic nation or a theonomic nation. Theonomos or theonomy is the idea of God's law becoming the center of American law, right? Nomos is law. And so this vision of a kind of Christian retrenchment within society, and then God mandating Christians to take over society, has become very, very popular. One of the major manifestations of this, and it again comes out of the NAR, is an idea called the Seven Mountain Mandate. This is another prophetic meme that's been popularized within the NAR. It originates with a friend of Dutch Sheets, another mentee of Peter Wagner's named Lance Wallnau. And the idea is that you can divide society up into these 7 spheres of influence: religion, media, family, government, education, arts and entertainment, commerce. And the idea is that Christians need to, that each of these are kind of imagined physically as a mountain. And the top of that mountain is either controlled by Satan and demons or by Christians and God. And so their vision is Christians need to conquer the tops of all the 7 mountains. Dutch Sheets is very into this idea. In fact, it's part of the undergirding of the Appeal to Heaven flag campaign, is that Christians need to take over the 7 mountains. That is an outline of Christian supremacy, right? That is a formula, a strategy for Christian supremacy that they claim is a prophecy. But that idea, the 7 Mountain Mandate, gets more than 50% approval among American evangelicals today. Now, not that all those people are NAR followers per se, but that the idea that the viralness of that concept has spread into broader Christianity because it fits the mood of American Christians who feel like the country is being taken away from them and who want to take it back.
So within, what you're saying, my understanding is that the apostles see themselves as the generals in this spiritual warfare, that, the prophets are subordinate to them. It's a very authoritarian, top-down leadership structure. And so, that 50% or whoever who are influenced by this, well, that's kind of the goal, isn't it? That you have the apostles at the top of the leadership chain. They get their marching orders directly from the Holy Spirit. They cannot be contradicted or, rebutted with Scripture because they're answering to the Holy Spirit alone. And I just see it as a form of spiritual abuse. But then if you're not with them, as you said, you're controlled by the demons. So if you're a Democrat or if you're, a mainstream, mainline Christian or Jewish or, whatever, and you're not buying into their Christian nationalist ethos, you're demonic. And it's a very strong us versus them, ethos, no?
No, absolutely. In fact, the NAR is very fond because they're so into spiritual warfare, and they have a particular vision of spiritual warfare that they would say that the forces that oppose the church are centrally organized by what they call territorial spirits. So these are what we read in the book of Ephesians about principalities and powers. Well, Peter Wagner believed that those were territorial spirits, that they are demon commanders who hold literal physical territory and control human institutions. And so the idea is that the apostles and prophets are specially anointed by God to displace these powers and principalities, to do spiritual battle against these territorial spirits. This was a very big part of the mobilization for January 6th, was the belief that these demonic principalities were orchestrating the stealing of the election from Donald Trump. And one of the main reasons the Christians showed up that day was to do spiritual warfare against these believed principalities and powers who were stealing the election.
And it was preceded by what was called the Jericho March, right?
Yes, yeah, and NAR leaders were very influential, and the Jericho marches helped organize those. This is the Jericho marches is actually is a practice that comes out of Pentecostalism. People have been doing Jericho marches inside their churches as part of spiritual warfare for decades, but it was again appropriated by NAR leaders as a way to galvanize Christians around Donald Trump's election lies. Dutch Sheets sometimes even uses a metaphor, a military metaphor. They're very fond of military metaphors. So the idea of apostles and prophets governing the church actually comes out of Ephesians chapter 4. And in Ephesians 4, the author lists 5 ministry offices or roles that exist in the church. They are apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And Dutch Sheets sometimes uses a military analogy and says, the pastors in the church, they are like the cooks or the medics in the military. They just patch people up or feed them. They make sure the sheep are all well fed. The soldiers are all well fed. And the teachers in the church are like the drill sergeants who are training the troops, right? And teaching them how to operate. The evangelists are like the military recruiters. They're getting more soldiers in the army. But then when you come to the prophets and the apostles, it's different. The prophets are like the military intelligence because they see into the spiritual realm and they're spying. They're getting direct knowledge from God about the strategies of the enemy, and then they're helping to advise the apostles on those strategies. And when it comes to apostles, they're very fond of this idea. Apostles are the generals. Apostles are able to orchestrate campaigns of spiritual warfare. And Dutch Sheets even says, when he uses this analogy, if the church was only led by pastors and teachers, we'd never kill anyone. Generals know that sometimes you have to kill people, right? And I'm sure if you asked him, he'd say, oh, I was being metaphorical. But at some point, you have to start crediting their military metaphors for the real instigation of violence that they are perpetuating.
So you have really opened up a whole new world that I was certainly not aware of, at least not to the extent that I would. Some of the things that you are talking about are just eye-opening. We're almost out of time, though. I'm wondering if you can just advise people who are consuming media, Christians who are concerned about what's happening in the political space. What are some of the hints? What are some of the giveaways that what they're consuming is actually messaging from the NAR?
So a dead giveaway is the word dominion, especially when that word dominion is applied to human beings, right? I mean, part of their inspiration is they look at Genesis chapter 1, where God gives dominion over creation to the man and the woman. But they have amplified that into an entire theological worldview that says that Christians need to take dominion over every society. Christians need to take dominion over their fellow human beings, right? That's not happening in Genesis chapter 1. There aren't any other human beings. It's just the man and the woman, right? But they've turned this into this doctrine. This stuff is also very much carried through worship music. And a lot of evangelical worship music, in fact, most evangelical worship music today originates in the independent charismatic world. And you have these powerhouse worship ministries like Elevation and Hillsong and Bethel. And these ideas of dominion have often gotten encoded in some of those songs. The vision of Christians taking power, the vision of even revival and reformation, these terms that are fairly innocuous in the Christian tradition, have gotten coded around these political messages. And so a lot of the radicalization that is going on centers on Donald Trump, but also on these visions of Christian conquest, this language of Christian domination, this language of warfare as it gets integrated in. I'm very suspicious when Christians start talking about a victorious Christianity. Because at least in my reading of Jesus, that is not what Jesus was teaching. Instead, he told us to turn the other cheek. In fact, I think in many ways Christianity has flourished when it's been on the margins, when it has not gotten mucked up with the cynical powers of this world. But these folks are very ready to throw in with Donald Trump. One of the other major ideas that they have used, that again actually comes from Lance Wallnau, the same guy who came up with the Seven Mountains idea, is this idea that Donald Trump is a modern day Cyrus, or has a Cyrus anointing. Cyrus is the ancient emperor of the Persian Empire in the roughly 6th century BCE, who sends the Jewish people back from exile. In Isaiah chapter 45, the author of Isaiah actually refers to Cyrus as a type of Messiah. He's an anointed one. And so many of these NAR leaders have picked up this idea and popularized it, that Donald Trump has a Cyrus anointing, that God has a special mission for Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump is commissioned by God to return conservative Christians from cultural exile. Now, if you hear this Cyrus language...
I'm going to have to cut you off because we're going to have to do a part 2 and maybe a part 3, but we are way out of time. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure. Happy to be here.
This has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach here with Bettina Krause. Until next time, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.